Hey everyone, hope you're doing well. This is Drew Creekmer here with John Creekmer for Creekmer Wealth Advisors, and this is the deep dive. And today we're going to talk about some news that came out regarding inflation and what the Federal Reserve is doing about it. We're going to give you a sneak peek of what we're also anticipating to come down the rail tracks here in 2023 from an economic and market standpoint as well. But before we do that, John, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Drew. I'll tell you, I think I have all my Christmas shopping done, so that's a good thing.
Amazing.
Um, and I will say my prices this year were quite a bit higher than what they were last year, as far as what I paid for Christmas gifts, and the shipping to get it here is also higher. And so that was kind of a interesting thing to see. And I know our electricity bill's higher this year, and I'm seeing that. I just filled up my propane tank for heating for the winter, and that was a little bit higher, and just renewed my contract. So it's amazing how over the course of the last 12 months, everything has gone up drastically. I know even within the office, we're anticipating a 13 to 16% increase across the board from all of our vendors,
Yeah.
the people that we end up subscribing to their services. I know our CFO, outsourced CFO, just told me a 13% increase for next year as far as our price for him. And so we're seeing it across the board. It's happening everywhere.
Yeah.
And so I'm realizing that in my Christmas shopping this year.
Yeah, and I think you're hitting on what we're going to talk about here, which is inflation, right?
Yeah. Right.
That's been the story of the year here in 2022, and it's going to continue to be the story as we move into 23, as it relates to the economy and markets. And we're all feeling that with our personal spending for sure. So, John, today we had a inflation reading for the month of November came out. The headline was encouraging. Inflation's down to 7.1% from 7.3% month over month. However, when you look at the underlying data, we're seeing that services are still increasing month over month. And so services are a form of what's called sticky inflation, right? So that means that it's going to be tougher to bring down with the blunt tools that the Federal Reserve has at their disposal. And so, how should we interpret this inflation reading, and really, what does that mean for the economy as we move into the new year, John?
Yeah, so really, it's kind of going through winners and losers. Whenever we look at that, you mentioned the core inflation, sticky inflation, and we look at other services. So you can pick and choose and look at different things to see how they've increased or decreased. So, and it's going to benefit you in different ways, or it's going to hurt you in different ways. And so, looking at the numbers, we know that pricing for hotel stays is actually down in the last month. And then pricing for air travel has actually started going down. And the reason being is that we had a huge demand boom through the summer months at the same time that oil was very high.
Right.
And so we can't say that all of the news was bad, but the things that we are looking at that really impact us long term is what's called sticky inflation. So kind of think back, if you would, the last 2 or 3 years, and there was a real push to get to a nationalized federal minimum wage of $15 an hour for those on hourly, to get people back to a living wage. Well, the reality is that's a good thing, right?
Yeah.
And so it's a good thing for those families to make money. However, where it turns into a bad thing as far as overall in the economy is that as people have more dollars, the cost of things, because it's, we have a limited number of supply, the cost of things, there's more dollars now, people are making more hourly, so the cost of things actually increases. And so for the folks that are on the hourly wage, they went to $15 an hour, we're actually seeing standard of living below real standard of living below what it actually was before they received the increase. And the reason being is that the sticky elements, the ones that are impacted mostly by labor prices, the ones that are impacted by base level goods that are increasing, that are actually accretive, those are things that we see that have a long lasting impact. Now, there's other things we have to look at, such as the cost of fuel. Let's say as an example,
Right.
gasoline and diesel are the components that basically motorize or fuel our entire economy. So we have seen a decrease, and as far as in oil and diesel inputs over the last month. However, it takes time to work through the system.
It does.
And so we're moving a good from a port in one country to a port in America, and then you get it on either rail or also onto a tractor trailer and then drive it. Every single step along the way, there's new inputs as far as in fuel.
Right.
And so those are things that are take 3 or 4 months to work through the system. We are anticipating in the next 3 to 4 weeks to actually see a bottoming in the price of gasoline and in the cost of diesel due to refineries running past capacity. So big picture, the frontline number is actually very positive. We saw us go from 7.3 to 7.1 on an estimated. The realized is 7.1. The index rose by just 0.1%, as anticipated, rise by 0.3%.
Yeah.
So across the board, that is good. But under the surface, there's a little more devil in the details.
There is. And John, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about some geopolitical things that are going to play a big role here in 2023. Obviously, we have the war between Russia and Ukraine that has affected a lot of commodity prices across the board. But we also have China reopening. They're ending their zero COVID policy, and China is the largest economy in the world. So, what are some of the potential impacts of the largest economy of the world getting back to normal? And just for some context here, if you look year over year from 21 to 22, air travel within China was down over 40%. So think about all of the oil and all of the other things that are required to move that many people. What is the impact to the global economy of China kind of re-entering the fold?
We're looking at a country of over 1.4 billion people. And when the 1.4 billion people are really either restrained to their homes or have limited capacity to be around, or whenever jobs are shut down simply due to COVID, they had a zero COVID policy.
Yeah.
And we've seen that politically, as time has gone on, that's been very damaging to political leadership within the country. And so whenever they then went back a number of weeks ago, it's actually about 4 or 5 weeks ago now, of some uprisings and protests due to the fact that people saying they're not going to be locked and bolted in their houses anymore,
Yeah.
in their apartments anymore. They had to have a political change. And so whether or not it was actually due for health and safety issues, the reality is they were creating quite a problem. What that does, though, is more people, that 1.4 billion, so we know we're over 8 billion people in the world. And so as we see that large population becoming more active, increasing their job performance as far as hours worked, increasing their pay, also increasing with their productivity, then what we are seeing actually is their economy is starting to actually grow. And so with that, there's some positives for the global economy, and that we're going to see actually a supply issue being taken care of. So Federal Reserve, they're dealing with the demand side of things, which would be simply raising of interest rates decreases the ability for people to buy more goods and services and expand the economy. Not really dealing with supply side. That's usually more of a governmental action.
Right.
But what we're going to see, though, is with China, who's one of our largest importers, so as far as folks that we import from, they're one of the largest exporters in the world. They've created a supply issue with their COVID policy. And so as we see more goods and services being produced, coming, especially goods coming out of China, that's actually going to decrease some of the inflationary pressure. At the same time, we'll see a corresponding increase in inflation in other areas as they become more mobile and are traveling a lot more. So it's something to watch with a huge impact as far as overall global economy.
Yeah. And so, that's a huge story that we're going to keep our eye on as we move into 23. Now, John, let's kind of shift over to the Federal Reserve because we've talked a lot about them the last few weeks with the rate increases. They're going to continue with that here in December, increasing by 0.5% is the expectation, with another increase coming in January. But one of the things we've not talked about as much, and which might be a bigger story, is the Fed balance sheet. And so one of the big drivers of inflation here in the last year has been how much money supply there is. And so obviously think back to 2020. We shut down our economy, we dropped interest rates to zero, and then to also stimulate the economy, we pumped trillions of dollars into the system. And anytime you increase the monetary supply, inflation also increases. So one of the things the Federal Reserve is doing, in addition to increasing interest rates, they're looking to decrease their balance sheet. And we're going to put a chart up here to show some historical trends in the Fed balance sheet. But John, what is the impact of the Fed decreasing their balance sheet? What does that even mean?
Yeah. So whenever we hear a lot of times folks say, "Oh, the government's just printing more money," and so the reality is to take it out from like the common everyday vernacular and kind of get it more into the down and dirty of the economic system. In essence, what they're doing is they're putting more dollars into the system. And so as those dollars go into the system, they actually filter through the system. So there's more dollars in. You have a limited amount of goods or resources. And so those more dollars are demanding more goods and resources. So that increases the cost of goods and services. And so that's just basic economics 101 as far as on the macro side. Now, whenever we see the Federal Reserve decreasing the balance sheet, well, does that mean they're just simply pulling dollars out and setting them on fire? Not at all. They're simply readjusting the balance sheet. And so that means they're bringing dollars in and they're sending treasuries out. And so when they're doing that, those dollars are still there on the balance sheet. So whenever we see them wanting to slow down the economy, they have a number of tools. At the end of the day, it boils down to two main tools. One is the interest rates that they're able to charge banks to lend money to each other and to borrow money from the Federal Reserve. And so, in other words, if they're increasing interest rates on that side, when they talk about increasing interest rates by 3/4 of a point or half a point, it's really increasing the interest rates of the loans of which the Federal Reserve is charging banks, and the loans that banks are able to charge each other on deposits. And so, in doing that, it makes their lending capacity at a higher cost. And so, whenever we see that, that slows down expansion or people borrowing money. On the flip side of the equation, the second tool they have is actually how many dollars are in circulation. And so we see them actually taking the dollars out of circulation and returning that back with Treasury securities. And in doing so, that means there's less dollars which are floating through the system. So whenever supply of dollars goes down, that would actually decrease the amount of demand overall in the system and slow down the economy. So the Federal Reserve has actually decreased it right now. We're sitting about 4.27% off the high. You're able to see in that chart. And Drew, there's two different time periods that we have on here. Would you want to discuss the impact of those and why we're watching this drawdown with really a high degree of interest?
Yeah. So, we have February of 09 and August of 19. Now let's talk about February of 09. I mean, we think about 08, 09, we all know that as the Great Recession, right? And we had a massive issue here in our economy where people were taking out too risky of loans, and that led to a big global meltdown. And so one of the ways the Federal Reserve had to manage that was reducing their balance sheet. And so by doing that, that led ultimately into a recession. When we go to August of 19, now, John, you may have to remind me, I don't believe we actually hit a recession in 2019. However, we did see a lot of stock market volatility towards the end of the year there. And so whether we're going into a recession, which we think is likely in 23 or not, what we can expect is the Federal Reserve continues to decrease their balance sheet. We're going to see an increase in stock market volatility. And so we are closely watching this drawdown in this chart here to see how deep we go, because that will be an indication of what type of economic situation and market situation that we are walking into. I think right now, it's safe to say most people are expecting a recession sometime around the middle of 23, based upon the data that we're looking at here.
Yeah, and I think it's something to keep in mind too is whenever we see large movements from the Federal Reserve, which is impacting simply dollars on the balance sheet, and a lot of times folks look at the stock market as volatility. The actual biggest driver of the volatility is actually the U.S. dollar or the Federal Reserve Treasury market. And so, to put in perspective, the average daily volume as far as on U.S. Treasury securities, it is something like 7 times the average daily volume of U.S. stock market movement. And so it's such a large market that whenever they make adjustments as far as one way or the other, and the pacing of the adjustments, it affects the economy at a higher and higher pace. So we've got to be aware of that, folks. If you have an interest in learning more about money supply, one of the senior economists that we follow a lot, his name is Brian Westbury. A phenomenal resource. Just reach out to the office or get a reply back off of the website. And we can actually, he has a weekly commentary he sends out. A lot of our clients receive that from them. It's tremendous information to help you increase as far as your education and not be listening to the news screaming at you.